welcome to the webinar, The Impact of COVID-19 on the Renewable Energy Industry in the MENA region. So we'll have three presentations today, and I'll get the speakers to introduce themselves. So Ahmed, would you mind briefly introducing yourself with a couple of, just very briefly?
Yes, sure. Thank you very much, Carlos, and thank you very much for inviting me to participate to this webinar. So my name is Ahmed Mizio. I'm a senior legal counsel at AMEA Power, a power energy developer based in Dubai.
Thank you very much, Ahmed. And Katia, could you please introduce yourself briefly and get ready to present?
Yes, absolutely. Thank you so much, Carlos, first of all, for having invited me to present and to talk at this seminar for such an interesting topic and a hot topic for us, obviously. So my name is Katya Kushnareva. I work as principal counsel and as a global sector lead for environmental and municipal infrastructure in the legal department of the International Finance Corporation. I'm based in Dubai, but I do work globally, and I do see the impact on the projects also globally around the world.
Thank you very much, Katia. And Anna, if you could stop sharing the initial screen so Katia can start her presentation. Thank you very much. So, well, over to you, Katia. So what's in store for us for the renewable energy industry given the COVID-19 crisis?
Yeah, thank you so much, Carlos. So yes, I wanted to make it as interactive as possible, even though we are making it virtual, so that I can set the stage for further presenters and further discussions. And I think the interesting part for us today is that in this group we have representatives of the developers, of the lenders, and on both sides of the investors, and on both sides we do see also how the governments are behaving in this crisis. So I think that gives us many perspectives on lessons learned and on things that we're taking forward. So the way I wanted to structure the discussion today on my end is basically to first touch on the things that we see happening and issues that we see popping up in different countries in the region, as we have been observing during the past couple of months the impact of the COVID-19 over the power industry. And then maybe spend a little bit more time talking about what do we see happening that could affect the developers' situation, where do we see governments coming up, and what do we see governments bringing up as part of the consequences of the crisis impact. And also, I wanted to just maybe give a couple of pointers on what are the particular concerns that the lenders are now taking forward with respect to the new projects that we're now working on, given the implications of the crisis. So with that, let me first start from developers, going back to the developers' perspectives. Whenever we as a lender finance the project, obviously the first thing that we look into is the project document base, right? And from that perspective, of course, it is important for any IPP project, for project to proceed to be bankable from the lender's perspective. Bankable meaning that the developer gets adequate protections and the regime of the rights and obligations is balanced. So when COVID-19 hit, under many contracts, under many PPA contracts, in MENA, we faced, and not only in MENA actually, that happened all around the world. We had a massive inflow, developers informing us of massive inflow of force majeure notices. So these notices sometimes were coming from their contractors. Sometimes the developers were evaluating a situation and were considering whether they would want to send a force majeure notice to the utilities. Most markets in which we work, in which we finance projects, are emerging markets, meaning that these are single buyer markets as opposed to merchant markets. So they do benefit from the IPP schemes and feed-in tariff schemes for renewable energy, and from the PPAs where we look at bankability allocation, as I mentioned. So typically, from what we have seen so far, whenever we looked at the situation of force majeure arising under a particular project, in vast majority of the countries and cases, the project documentation typically would cover for force majeure and for the consequences of force majeure, and would give specific protection to the developer as part of the documentation. Typically, again, what we see is that this protection is time relief. Sometimes under limited circumstances, you can see cost relief. One of the lessons learned that I think is very important to note is that, and that is something that we typically do as part of the due diligence, but it is becoming even more prevalent, is the back-to-back protections that you have in your EPC contract vis-a-vis the PPA, right? So these contracts need to match. We were usually careful in evaluating whether the provisions of the PPA are passed through into the EPC contract, but now it becomes even more so important, because the last thing what we want to see on the project is EPC contractor, for example, being able to claim costs where the project company, for example, cannot recover these costs under the PPA. So yes, as I mentioned, in EPC contracts, we typically also see time relief, and pandemic typically qualified as other force majeure under the PPA contract, or natural force majeure, depending, from jurisdiction to jurisdiction, it actually differs. Or certainly, the implementation of force majeure and the implementation of remedies allowed under the contractual framework are largely dependent on drafting of specific contracts, but also are typically, based on the same grounds, and the company would need to demonstrate the impact of the force majeure, and also will need to properly maintain the process of communicating with the off-taker in terms of the occurrence of the force majeure per se. With respect to the projects that are in construction, we've seen situations where developers were effectively channeling back the force majeure notices to the government based on their EPC contractors approaching them with force majeure notices as well. And obviously, the interesting thing here, the interesting part was that the basis for invoking force majeure was, as I've mentioned, pandemic is usually typically qualified as a natural force majeure. But if you look at all of the countries in our region, right, and not only in MENA region, most of the countries such as Jordan, Egypt, and many other countries in the region, following the evolution of the pandemic, they implemented specific regimes, lockdown regimes, restrictions regimes, travel bans, and consequences on the projects were caused by these restrictions rather than the pandemic itself. And the interesting thing is that that we discovered in a number of projects is effectively, whether you can claim relief on the basis of the consequences of the force majeure, and what additional protections can be available to project companies based on that. Again, this caused quite a bit of a debate in some of the projects that we have seen in some countries, and that is Egypt and Jordan as well, as to whether the events under question are natural force majeure event or government force majeure event. And the reason for this debate is also very interesting and very insightful, because obviously, when you think about projects in construction, it is particularly important, it could be particularly important for developers, because if an event is qualified as a government force majeure, then the developers can seek certain additional protections, typically cost protections, or, for example, protections under the deemed energy regime. Whilst for natural force majeure, these protections would not be available. This could also potentially impact the termination regime as well, because for other force majeure event, very frequently under many IPP systems deployed in our region, for example, Egypt is one of these examples. The project company, in case of the other force majeure, prolonged other force majeure, would not be able to terminate the IPP contract, whilst the in case of government force majeure, the consequences would be different. So that is I think is the evolving debate that is still continuing, and I would be very interested to hear from my co-presenters what they are seeing. But we are seeing this debate evolving in a number of countries in the region, and we are also seeing a thought process as to whether basically, in a situation situation where pandemic is evolving and governments are taking measures, it should be made very explicit in the PPAs that the companies can still seek change in law protection with respect to the changes that are being implemented. Because in a number of countries, we've seen the government disclaiming this ability, saying that it is a natural force majeure, so only time relief should be available, not other forms of the relief, again, which legally we disagree with. And also there is a general debate now happening in the market as a result of the evolving events as to whether there is merit in pushing the pandemic into government force majeure events as opposed to natural force majeure events, which from the private sector perspective, that is something that the private sector has seen becoming a big issue in PPAs, and in PPAs being unwrapped effectively by the governments as part of this crisis. And I'll get to this in a couple of minutes when we talk about the government perspective on the consequences of the crisis with respect to the PPAs. I think also, an important point to mention and a lesson learned in this crisis is that for the natural force majeure events, we talked about this in the past when we were evaluating IPP projects, but we never saw practical implementation. Typically, the comfort that the lenders were getting from not having the ability of the parties to terminate for long-term other force majeure was that this is something that could potentially benefit from insurance protection. Now, this crisis has proven that this is not a correct statement, because in most of the instances where there is no real property damage, we have seen that the companies were not able to make use of the business interruption insurance or any other insurances, and any insurance cover that could potentially cover for that will be very expensive, and it's questionable whether the companies would be willing to take on this insurance cover in the market. Now, with that, I will switch to where we're seeing the governments coming out. So what do the governments think in this crisis? The governments think, well, this crisis has shown, right, creating significant deficits on the sovereign side, that we as governments sometimes are locked up into very expensive long-term PPAs that create a huge fiscal drag on our resources. And what do? We need to make choices in this situation. We can't simply, we can't continue as is, because we don't have, as a government, resources to comply with all of the obligations under the PPA. And in some countries, the governments have made assessments and thought that the tariff is no longer sustainable. And here, we have a couple of interesting examples which played out, due to this concept into a variety of disputes, ongoing disputes between the single off-takers, single buyer off-takers, and the developers, where effectively off-takers are coming back and saying, I'm not going to pay you in full because I have another force majeure event, which is a pandemic. So my obligation not to pay is going to be excused by that. Now, under the laws of most jurisdictions, the obligation to pay would not be excused by force majeure. And most of the PPAs in our region, thankfully, explicitly provide that the payment obligation should not be excused by force majeure. But there are some interesting cases where, for example, you would see some references in some of the countries in the region that, yes, it will not excuse non-payment, except if the banking system is unavailable. And then, the off-takers, what we have seen in practice, are trying to tag this into a very kind of evolved discussion as to whether they can seek payment relief on this basis. And again, most of the government-owned off-takers, and that concerns this region, the MENA region, and also other regions as well. We've seen it also in Latin America. We've seen it in Eastern Europe as well, and have taken a position that the event under question is only a natural force majeure event. It can't be qualified as a government force majeure event, even though the changes that evolved after this event are clearly a change in law and are clearly creating consequences. And even though under frameworks applicable in some jurisdictions, a change in law is in itself a government force majeure event, such as Jordan, for example. So that's been a debate, an ongoing debate so far. And this is where the governments were trying to get relief for their payment obligations on operating IPP projects in a number of jurisdictions, claiming force majeure as an ability to get out of their commitments. So that's one thing we have seen on the government side. The reason for the governments coming up with all of these issues is obviously, you know, the strain on the budget deficit that I mentioned, on the sovereign budget deficit. But not only that, there is certainly an overcapacity issue that is coming into play, and there is also an issue of how, you know, things are going to be managed going forward, particularly where, for example, there is a significant number of IPPs entered into, PPAs entered into in a particular market with overcapacity considerations. And in some markets, thankfully, at least, you know, I haven't seen this so far in MENA, but in some other markets, the governments have been simply bringing PPA completely for renegotiation or imposing interim PPAs for the duration of the states of emergency with significantly cut down tariffs and significantly cut down protections for the developers as well. So that's been a very concerning factor in a number of jurisdictions, and we're carefully observing the market because, you know, I think we still yet have to see, you know, what happens next and whether there are any far-going consequences in this respect. One aspect probably, you know, I also wanted to mention is what are sort of, you know, the lenders' responses, right? And how we are looking at this situation as the lenders, because obviously, you know, for us, we're looking at projects and we're evaluating, particularly projects that are in our portfolio, we're looking at whether they can sustain the additional drain that is created by the current crisis, and whether the covenants still work, whether the ratios still work, whether, you know, whether any of the covenants are going to be breached, or whether there is a potential MAE event of default or other events of default in question, particularly in projects that are getting close to distributions or the projects that are getting close to disbursements as well. And for the new projects that are still in development phases, I think what we do see in the market is that there is a significantly increased level of due diligence on construction schedules and budgets for obvious reasons, for buffers and contingencies to address the current sort of crisis environment, and for the financial model, obviously, as well, to assess how this could be impacted by ongoing and future pandemic impacts. Everybody is recognizing that the situation is fluid and is developing. We are really seeing, one thing we're seeing is that increased level of due diligence is also on the impact that the pandemic is having on the creditworthiness of the counterparties, including IPP grantors, and including also the off-takers, the EPC contractors, the suppliers, so the whole value chain effectively. As I mentioned, you know, one of the issues is basically the thinking behind whether pandemics continue to be classed as natural force majeure, or we move them into a political force majeure bucket because of the remedies distinction, as I've just explained. That's an ongoing debate. Although, in my view, honestly, I think the governments are highly unlikely to accept the move of the pandemics into the government force majeure. So lenders have been revisiting thinking on material adverse effect conditions in terms of making it clear that the pandemic could constitute a material adverse effect, notwithstanding the fact that it is foreseeable and ongoing at the time, and that now we are aware that this condition is persisting and continuing in the market. We still kind of, you know, we are evaluating it from our perspective in terms of the impact on the documentation. There is ongoing thinking in this regard. Some deals, as we do see, have been put on hold as a result of the pandemic, and there is slowdown in process and negotiation. Also because now the appraisals will all have to be, or due diligence has to be virtual largely. So it is bringing additional issues onto the table as to how this is conducted, what is the assurance, what is the possibility to get additional information as well. I think in terms of the documentation, the financing documentation itself for the ongoing projects, I think of course all lenders are carefully assessing whether the documentation contains sufficient protections for the lenders given the existing environments and how we deal with the FM events going forward. So that's an ongoing thinking process as well in terms of the lessons learned. And projects that are going to credit during the continuation of the pandemic are naturally needing to address the potential impacts of the pandemic to the satisfaction of our investment committees. So we are looking at macro context from this perspective. We are looking at the context of how balanced the sectoral approach is from the government perspective, and we're trying to evaluate this as well. So a lot of new things coming into play from our perspective as a lender, and I'll probably stop here with that and pause, and I would be very interested to hear from my co-presenters because I think there are so many cross-cutting themes as we are looking at the consequences. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Katerina. Very interesting presentation. Many food for thought definitely. But I won't take much time, and instead I'll give the floor to Ahmed, who I'm sure is will have also very interesting things to share. So over to you, Ahmed, and whilst you are loading up your presentation and sharing your screen, I'd like to remind the audience that you will get a recording of this webinar and the slides that will be delivered as well. So I can see one lonely question there in the Q&A box. I'd like to encourage you to post more questions. I think there are lots of interesting and difficult ramifications to the COVID-19 event, let's call it, and do the renewable energy project. So I'm sure you have questions, so post them to the Q&A box. It's your chance to get answers. So over to you, Ahmed.
Yeah, thank you very much, Carlos. Again, thank you very much for for inviting me to speak and to share some insights. From a developer perspective on all the consequences of COVID-19 on some of the projects in the MENA region. Well, Katia, thank you very much for the comprehensive presentation. I think you covered it all. So I'm just going to go through a few points, maybe, just to share my perspective as a developer. So lessons learned, I think lessons learned from dealing with the consequences of COVID-19, and I divided this section into two, for projects under constructions and for projects under operation. So for project under construction, as we've seen in the MENA region, the disruption caused by COVID-19 created a situation which resulted into delays in meeting key construction and work milestones. And defaults, technical defaults under the funding arrangement. The situation would have had several critical consequences if these were not remediated on time through various project restructuring. So there was a lot of discussion between the lenders, the developers, the EPC contractor, and the off-takers about the best way to address the current situations and the current difficulties faced for the past few months. And I know that there are still ongoing discussion on some pending points as well. So one of the examples, the examples of possible consequences include liquidated damages, loss of incentives, call on bonds, delays for construction completions, termination for time limits exceeded. So what we have seen is that most of the developers and contractors were trying to seek reliefs under the relevant project documents by relying on force majeure, on the change in law, on hardship clauses to allow for time extensions and to some extent, in some circumstances, and depending on the documents, also some compensations and cost relief. So would such attempt result into successful claims? That's a tricky question. So the starting point, I think, when seeking relief should be to look at the project and finance documents and discuss the consequences of the delays with the different stakeholders. So exemption, delay LDs, termination events. So that's the sorts of things that we look at in the documents. The agreements should reflect the parties' expectations and in line with international best practices. And the most important also is actually to implement some sort of collaborative approach between all the parties, which is fundamental in such times, as this helps establishing communication channels to respond to quickly developing situations and free up crucial resources to focus on the required responses. So for projects under operation, what we have also seen is that the governments in the MENA region continues to implement new legislations, regulation in response to the consequences of COVID-19. What we have also seen is that governments might attempt to reduce electricity supply generated by PPPs by issuing regulations and orders, and this may be due to the fall in electricity demand caused by the containment measures taken by most of the countries, or maybe the fall in oil prices, which may be seen as an opportunity maybe for some countries to postpone their energy mix objectives. These many questions, and many points were raised whether this would be successful. Whether actually such measures would be lawful or not, whether these could constitute a change in law. That's what we are going actually to see in the next slides. So developers and EPC contractor were trying to, I wouldn't call it actually to hide behind actually the force majeure or the change in law, but I would call it as a kind of relying actually on the force majeure clauses and the change in law clauses actually to request a time extensions and cost reliefs. So force majeure, generally speaking, of force majeure, unforeseeable circumstances such as the recent outbreak of COVID-19, which may prevent a party from fulfilling its contractual obligation, may fall within the definition of force majeure in certain contracts and certain situations. Well, most of the local laws in MENA countries provides for a definition of force majeure in the law. Civil law countries usually provides for a definition of force majeure. And the English law, there is no general principle of force majeure. So the agreements, for example, PPAs and EPC contract, they shall provide for a definition of force majeure, which scope will be limited to that set out in the force majeure clauses. So the change in law, what is change in law? Quickly, it's the occurrence after a defined date, example, the date of the agreement or the submission date for the project of the following, the adoption or taken effect of any law, rules, regulations, any change in any law, regulation, or treaty, or the making or issuance of any request, guideline, directives by any government authority. This is a kind of general definition actually of change in law that actually we come across in different agreements. So change in law or regulation driven by COVID-19 outbreak may result in a widening of the scope of relief available to the extent it can be shown that the issues affecting the projects stem from such changes. So force majeure and change in law clauses, these are specific to each agreement, and these clauses operate as a risk allocation mechanism in order to govern situations which are beyond the control of the parties, such as the outbreak of diseases like COVID-19, war, or natural disasters. What would developers and contractors need to do and to invoke in order to ascertain a force majeure or a change in law? A few points here. They would need to check whether there is a direct link between the outbreak, the change in law regulation driven by the COVID-19 outbreak, and the impossibility to perform contractual obligations. They need to check what the notice periods for force majeure or change in law are. They need to check if they are entitled to any compensation during the force majeure or change in law event, and if there is any obligation to mitigate the effect of the force majeure or change in law event, which is usually the case. Also insurance, whether insurance may cover any of the expected losses arising as consequences of COVID-19 situation, and the rules governing early termination if the force majeure events persists. very quickly, I mean, some thoughts on on the impact of COVID-19, maybe on the financing of renewable energy projects. Again, only from the perspective of developers. What we have seen is that, I mean, developers may turn the COVID-19 situations into an advantage, to their advantage, if they can take and seize some opportunities. They may take advantage of the existing low interest rate environment to further optimize the capital structure for energy infrastructure projects. But the above should be balanced against a shrinking appetite, maybe by lenders, given the high risk, the low yields, and the potential massive recession and credit crunch. As Katia was highlighting earlier, maybe lenders find it a bit difficult today to assess and to ascertain the risks for some projects, given that the situation is not clear and it's evolving. So IFIs like IFC, BRD, IFDB, and others are also allocating multi-billion fast-track financing to assist private sector companies in their efforts to tackle COVID-19. And power sector, I think, is a priority for these international financial institutions. So developers have been approaching their lenders and to explore a possibility to benefit from that multi-billion fast-track financing package. I think two essential elements and two essential objectives were sought by developers during this crisis. First is to ensure better liquidity for projects under constructions. Some of the examples to achieve that would be to trying to draw the maximum of any uncommitted and disbursed facilities as long as this is still possible in the face of an increase in volatility created by COVID-19, and trying to inject equity to enhance liquidity and assess the net debt position for the purpose of testing any financial ratios before the reporting time, just to be on the safe side. The second element, which is to improve the project capital structure during this turmoil through managing the debt liability. Developers may consider reducing the debt burden through debt payback. This could be achievable if developers could take advantage of any low interest rate environments or actual opportunities. The second element is trying to obtain financial information, quantifying the consequences of COVID-19. Developers may need to stand ready to close financing once the market volatility storm clears. That's why they will need to collect as much as information so they can assess the risks themselves, and also help actually the lenders also in their objectives, in their work to assess and to quantify the risks. And this is it. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Ahmed. Very interesting presentation that covering some of the challenges faced by developers and what they could do to mitigate them. So we'll talk more about that in the discussion part of the webinar. But for now, I'll give the floor to Badr Dracy so he can deliver his presentation. So Badr, over to you.
Thank you, Carlos. Thank you very much. And also I would like to thank my co-speakers for the very insightful thoughts and elements they shared with us. I'll try to share with you some thoughts we are developing on these topics from an investor perspective, maybe a developer also, and we think that it's important to mention that today numerous countries are aware about the importance of renewable energies for their local economies, but also for long-term growth. And some of them have announced various stimulus packages or relief plans to support their economies and population. But the fact is, we are still in a phase during which decision makers are focused on handling the health issues. And we need also to keep in mind that some countries are still in a critical phase in Latin America or some countries in the Middle East also, or Southeast Asia. So, and also we don't know yet if there will be the so-called second wave. So all what we can do today is try to understand, try to anticipate, but we think that there is a lot that we don't know yet about this crisis and its impacts. So regarding the projects under construction or operation, and again from a developer investor perspective, the issue is quite different, and I think my co-speakers spoke about it very interestingly regarding all the impacts on PPAs and contractual agreements. I will not develop this because I think they have more insights and more expertise on this. So, but they could be impacted, and they will be impacted in some ways. And the stakeholders, either the developers, the governments, or lenders, and so on, will need to address this issue on a case-by-case basis. We can't imagine a one solution for all the developers or investors in this space. So it will be addressed project by project, and it actually applies also to large utilities with concession, as they also would be impacted by the current crisis, and because in some countries contracts have been suspended, or at least during the lockdowns. In Morocco, we know that the utilities stopped billing the citizens to participate to the relief during the lockdowns. So for sure there will be discussions to either renegotiate the contracts or amend some aspects of them. So it will be very interesting and also challenging for all the stakeholders to advance on this. Going back to the government and their actions, and just to be realistic, there will be a situation where the country or the policymakers will have to choose between continuing their renewable energy strategies or redirecting their resources to other priorities like health and social welfare, given the current situation. And in some ways, it will also impact renewable projects and renewable strategies. It will be clearly a tough situation for the decision makers in this space. That being said, some of the policies announced so far has clearly stated that climate and renewable energy in particular are going to be a major component and driver of their actions and relief plans, to say the least. So some of them placed climate as a pivotal axis in the post-COVID era. Morocco announced a few weeks ago that it will not change the course of its renewable strategy. Europe also, and some other countries. So it's very interesting and encouraging for all the stakeholders in this sector. And for instance, we are very happy because yesterday Germany announced a large and ambitious strategy to develop green hydrogen with a 7 billion euros plan from now on till 2040. And one of the first initiatives that was signed officially yesterday during the presentation by the ministers is a cooperation between Germany and Morocco to develop a first renewable electricity facility dedicated to green hydrogen. So it's a 100 megawatt facility to start with. And it's very encouraging, and we are very happy for all the region. Actually, when we look at all the untapped resources, either wind or solar in our countries, we could address all the some of the hydrogen needs of Europe in the coming years. So this is just an example to show that maybe our countries with our limited resources will not be able to support or continue their ambitious strategies, but maybe there's co-strategies with Europe, for example, to develop further this sector and renewable projects. Regarding the preparation of companies to this crisis, we think, I mean, we all agree that this crisis is unique, large, and also humbling and insightful in so many ways for so many subjects. And I guess either on a personal or professional level, we learned a lot, either for policymakers, companies, or employees. And actually, this very webinar is a great example on how this crisis could and will change how we think, how we approach business, do business, and organize our life, either personal or professional life. So it's very, very insightful. And actually, if we had to get together in some place around the world to discuss this topic together, it would have had so many implications on our work, but also on our life. Now we can also organize a webinar like this one, or business meeting, get together, share ideas, share experiences, develop businesses. Of course, I'm not saying that it's better this way. For sure, social interactions are also part of project making and business management. But it was just an illustration of how the crisis changed probably forever some of our perceptions. Uh, I was going to say a misconception at some extent. So regarding the business impacts of the crisis, as mentioned before, it has and it will continue to have an impact. But we see these impacts on two levels, actually. On the short-term level, with actions taken during the lockdowns, isolations, and travel bans, and their repercussions in some countries, or also the changes imposed by these actions on processes, how organizations deal with these actions to comply with emergency requirements from each country. The second level, we think, is more permanent from our perspective, actually, and it implies a thorough, detailed review of all existing processes and strategies, either for project development, for business management, investment, etc., to make sure that what the crisis has shown us will not happen again, or at least we should prepare for it to reduce its impact. We can cite an example. I think we all think about it regarding the sourcing and supply chains that have been disrupted by the crisis, and some companies or sectors have been put under pressure or simply stopped because of the restrictions, and they couldn't source their raw materials or equipments, either again because of the lockdowns or because of their own manufacturers and suppliers were also impacted or shut down. So these aspects are very interesting to study. I mean, everybody is talking about the reshaping of global value chains. It's interesting to see how we can avoid this in the future in this specific sector, but we need to be careful to not, I mean, erase or reduce the benefits of these global value chains on production costs. We all know how solar benefited from these global value chains and outsourced productions. And we all think about the dependency, sorry, of some sectors on some suppliers or some countries. So we are not saying we need to reshape and relocate productions elsewhere, but maybe it needs to be addressed and see how to reduce this kind of risk in the future. The other aspect, which is very important for us as an organization, also we promote this kind of approach, is the human resources, and human resources as a real capital, given its importance within each organization. Its agility, it's the agility actually of every individual during this unprecedented times that allowed project and companies to keep moving, even if it was at a slower pace, sometimes a faster pace actually during these past months. But organization will have to revisit their management processes to include the lessons learned during this crisis. And we all, of course, think about remote working and how we do business in this kind of situations. The other aspect also is ESG. It's crucial in renewable projects. We all know about this, and it will be even more important in the future to make sure that the impacts such environmental and health safety are addressed in adequate manner. I mean, today more than ever, and in the future even more. And we already see this in some organization where they put the ENS and health safety as a prerequisite to their projects and actions. So it's a really a crucial aspect that we should bear in mind in future projects and future business relations. So regarding the lessons, we are very humbled by this crisis, and we think that the main lesson from this is that we can't anticipate all the risks. We can't, I mean, we are all trying to have this risk allocation and identify every risk and address it, and I mean, transfer it to the best party to handle it. But we cannot anticipate all the risk, and this crisis is the proof of it. So risk management is a continuous process. We should assess and reassess our risk and risk allocation continuously to understand and to identify where the future risk, I would say, are, and prepare for it. This global crisis is probably not the last, at least if we see it from a climate change perspective, and its future impacts on countries and businesses and projects. So it's important as project developers and investors to understand and keep in mind that the project we are currently developing, or investments we've made recently, will be impacted in the future on various scales. It could be a health crisis like the one we are living today, or climate-related impact, either directly or indirectly. What I'm trying to say, and from a pure basic investment perspective, we are mainly investor, is that maybe in few years, what is seen as profitable today will no longer be accepted because of either the ENS or health regulations from one side, or people perceptions, consumers actually, and considerations of consumers. For example, assets will be will be worth less, or don't find a buyer when we are trying to when we'll be trying to sell down or transfer an asset to another buyer, even if they are profitable, because investors are not willing to invest in this kind of assets because of the ENS or health issues. So it's really important aspects to keep in mind, especially that we are investing in long life assets, for 20 to 30 years for some assets. So we need to keep in mind that things and the environment are changing, and we should factor this in our project development and structuring. It's really important to have this long-term view, and we see it a lot from large institutional investors, and they are really thinking about this: how I am going to sell an asset in 10, in 15 years if the regulation change, if the ENS are more strict. So I need to understand now how I was going, how I was how to develop the projects to cope with these ENS issues and health issues in the future. So it starts with project identification, it starts with the technology selection, and also the processes implemented to make sure, or at least to try and address these future issues, and avoid having large, again, long life assets that will not find a buyer in the future. on a short-term note, project development and also material sourcing should be revisited, as mentioned, and each time that is possible, try to diversify the sourcing of materials and equipments for each projects. So maybe a last note. We thought a lot about this, and we try to have a clear answer, but we think it's maybe still early to understand all the implications in general, and each country in particular, either in the MENA region or other countries across the world. As mentioned, some countries have already stated that renewable energies will not. I mean, their renewable energy strategies will not change or will be accelerated to contribute to the post-COVID era plans. I mentioned the Germany plans. I also mentioned Morocco statement. And I think a few other countries in the region also mentioned that they will Saudi Arabia also, they will keep their strategy unchanged. But all we can do is continue advocating for the importance of renewables in the long-term growth and sustainability, and hope that policymakers will find enough fiscal resources in a very difficult fiscal context due to the current crisis to address, of course, the priority, which is the social and health needs of populations, but also support businesses on a more sustainable way. And renewable projects and renewable energies are, of course, one of the most important aspects of this. And that would be all, and I'll be glad to answer any question later.
Thank you very much, Bader, for your presentation. I think in this webinar, pretty much all presenters spoke for longer than intended, but what you were all saying was very interesting, so I didn't want to interrupt you. So if you don't mind, could we stay here for another 10 minutes to have answered some of the questions posed by the audience? Is that okay with all of you?
Sure.
Okay, great. So, well, I mean, I've been looking at the questions that we have here, and I mean, we could be here for like days talking about these things, because you have an environment in which you have a demand shock. So, you know, less electricity being demanded. You have, you know, governments being placed in a, which normally underwrite the off-takers being placed in difficult positions. You have renegotiate a context, at least, in which, you know, the PPAs, which are seen as very solid, could be renegotiated. It's a very difficult environment. So out of all of the questions that have been asked, I think there are two questions that could be that summarize the general, what everyone has in mind, really, and you know, what they would like to see answered. One, is there any consideration for having the using the renewable energy transition as a way to encourage economic recovery, employment and economic recovery? And the other one, which is, you know, the flip side of this question, is what is the likelihood of having a few years in which, well, essentially few renewable energy projects get developed and financed? So over to you. I don't know who wants to go first. Not all at the same time, please.
I could try to answer, or if I understand correctly. So what could be the impact on current projects, right?
The question was whether there were two questions. One of them, what is the chance that governments will will see renewable energy projects as a way to stimulate the economy? And the other question is, what is the chance that few renewable energy projects will be developed, or fewer than in the past will be developed and financed because of the environment we're in now?
Yeah, great. It's clear. Actually, yeah, I tried to address this during the presentation, and from our perspective, it's really a policy and country by country issue, because in some countries the fiscal resources will allow them to continue pursue their strategy. Some other countries will seize this opportunity and I mean try to uh, uh, direct or redirect their resources toward a more sustainable growth based on, of course, renewable energies. But I think some countries will have no choice but to reduce or revisit their ambitions regarding renewable energies and renewable projects. Hopefully, what could be interesting is cooperation between European countries or Western countries and MENA region countries, as the example I mentioned regarding cooperation between Morocco and Germany, and also the role of DFIs like World Bank, IFC, and so on. They also could help uh, and I mean advocate and encourage the governments to keep renewable energies or to put renewable energies as a major or at least a component of their relief and stimulus packages. So I think there is no clear answer today. It's still early. Some countries already announced that they will keep their strategies or push further. But I guess we'll just need to wait and see and continue advocating renewable energies as through this kind of webinars and initiatives.
And if I may just add up a little bit, I think
Please.
I completely agree. It's certainly a case by case analysis. I think what probably we will see, right, based on what governments are going through, is that first of all, the governments would be looking at the risk allocation under the PPAs maybe more cautiously going forward, particularly in terms of the tariff sustainability, right? The governments would probably take more time to evaluate what is really, how they approach the capacity, right? Because in many markets where we see overcapacity, this is typically a function of very inefficient, government decision making at some point, where the government, say, locked itself into a very disadvantageous PPA. Like, for example, you take Jordan and the Atarat case, right, where which is causing much bigger issue than the whole renewable energy package, even if you take the first mover advantage on the tariff side. I think someone had a really good question in terms of supply and demand, right? That the current IPP model basically does not encompass a possibility of conditioning tariff on the changes in the demand. And that's really a good question, but it's a very hard question to answer, because obviously, on the investor side, you would want to have a very significant risk premium if you were to go the route of accepting a risk that your tariff might fluctuate depending on the demand. And the current crisis has shown us, right, that demand shrinked. Well, maybe demand first of all, demand could shrink, but also, also government introduced measures where, for example, collection shrinked significantly because many utilities were not able to impose sanctions for failure to collect. And I think what we are looking into is a comprehensive macro analysis on the part of the governments when they are thinking about their renewable energy programs, in terms of how they can improve efficiency also in running these programs, and how they can make sure that that there are no sour PPAs in that respect. What the tariff should be? Are there any kind of possible ways to improve other aspects, collection, for example, or public generation? So there are so many puzzles. There are so many pieces to this puzzle, honestly, as of now, that we all going to see how the industry is going to be involving and picking this up. And what I can tell you, what we do see so far, is that in markets that are quite stable and where governments have quite sort of, an elaborate strategy on how to deal with renewable energy investments, they are continuing regardless, and new projects are being awarded, and sort of, but the governments are taking a second step in reevaluating, all the typical issues, the capacity capacity, the grid capacity, and the general capacity, so that, and of course, the tariff setting. So that is because the reason for the current crisis in many countries is that either the tariffs are super high and the governments are sort of revisiting the concept based on that, or the number of PPAs is super high, overcapacity issue, or there are some limited PPAs which are extremely disadvantageous, and this is affecting the whole sector altogether. And then, another question we have, maybe we need to reprofile, maybe governments need to think about the reprofile, maybe they need to see how they can amicably terminate the PPAs for the less efficient, say, diesel plants, and go more towards renewable energy. So there are so many routes that can be explored, and it will be done in the context of a specific economy and all the other specific circumstances at play, including, of course, the sovereign level situation and the intensity of the sovereign debt pressure. And, and I will say just last thing, just because, it's interesting, because, for example, if you look at Egypt, right, and the most recent measures taken in Egypt, for example, the tariffs actually for, apart from industrial tariffs, have been increased almost 20%. And on the other hand, the subsidies for the power sectors are going to continue for much longer than expected, for almost 3 years longer than expected, because IMF condition was to cut down the subsidies. But this is definitely something that is going to keep the power sector afloat for a while, and this tells you about how different governments are approaching the crisis situation from different perspectives.
Thank you, Kathy. And one thing I would remind the audience of as well is that actually in many countries in the region, solar and wind energy are the lowest priced energy. So it's the most cost competitive. So it would make sense for them to at least keep those projects and then maybe get rid of some of the older, less efficient plans, as you mentioned, Kathy. And then Ahmed, I don't know if you want to add anything on this question.
Yes, yes. Well, thank you very much. I mean, I completely agree with Badr and Katya, but well, it's going to be actually very tricky. I mean, for governments, for state utility off-takers and governments to get rid of, I would say, the old actually IPP structure that they have signed, some time ago. And we must also, keep in mind that actually some of these projects are also, sovereign guaranteed. So there's a sovereign guarantee actually which engage the primary obligations of the state vis-a-vis actually these projects. And we know, if you look to the PPAs, if you look actually to the gas to power actually project and CCGT project, for example, in some of the MENA regions, 10, 15 years ago, you will see very, very high tariffs, which are completely different actually from the tariffs that you can get today on the solar PV projects and also actually on the wind projects. So the market is getting too much competitive. Too many sponsors, too many developers trying to get projects. There are not many projects. That's actually what we can see and say. Because there's a lot of limitation as to the government's capacity to procure new projects. There is also some limitation into the grid capacity. As Katia was mentioning, many things. And I think that there would be a new area, a new time, a new period post-COVID-19, but it's not actually going to be the same as before. Why? Because the government, why? Because there will be a lot of pressure on the resources actually of the government, a lot of fiscal pressure. And second, because the market is getting too much competitive and maybe the demand is going to slow a bit. So the same structure of PPAs, for example, that we used to see before as the take or pay might not maybe work actually anymore. So maybe we are moving and shifting to much more I wouldn't really call it a balanced risk approach, but I would say a different risk allocation approach with a take and pay structures, maybe with lower maturity and lower actually tenor, lower actually periods. So I think it all depends on too many elements, but I think that we will see a different a different configuration of the markets in the next couple maybe of years.
Well, that's Certainly, I think that we'll see governments reacting, markets reacting. One last question, which I think summarizes, if you don't mind, summarizes some of the overall questions that have been asked. What's the impact of the oil price, low oil price, on renewable energy projects? What's the likely impact? In a traditional environment, you would think, well, some countries which already have a significant generation fleet with that relies on fossil fuels, they might continue burning fossil fuels. But what do you think would happen now? With what would be the effect on renewable energy projects of the low oil price?
It's $1 million question, Carlos.
All right,
No,
place your $1 million bet then. What
yeah.
Risk
Sure.
free. You don't have to put the
Yeah.
cash down.
It's a interesting and challenging question, actually, because of course what we could think is that these prices could impact negatively renewable projects and renewable strategies, because people will just keep with the fossil fuels generating assets. But we don't think that oil prices will stay this low. It's not sustainable, actually, for the whole economy. They will find at some point a more balanced tariff position, and again, it will come to governments' willingness to push further the SDGs agenda and all the sustainable strategies, and renewable projects are part of them. Again, I don't think there is, we didn't find it, we tried to analyze it, we didn't find a direct and obvious link between low oil prices and renewable projects or strategy, because again, renewable energies today are less dependent on this kind of arbitrage between oil prices and renewable electricity. We are beginning to be on a phase where renewable energy is not a nice to have, is a must have to address all the SDGs and all the environmental issues. So no clear answer, but probably the government will, some of them actually with the resources, will keep their strategies. We hope for this, actually.
If I can just say actually a few words, on this point. I would say every country, I would say every government actually in the MENA region, they have some sort of energy mix objectives. But I think these objectives might be postponed because the governments, the priority now actually for some governments is actually to survive, is actually to face a like very, very difficult situations. Some governments with some countries are reaching like the breaking point, and actually some sectors which are the monopoly of some actually state utility actually state-owned companies, they are facing real risk of bankruptcy and real risk actually of default. So I guess it's all a matter actually of lack of numbers and money and actually economics. So if they are going to find it a bit pricey, to go ahead with their actually objectives, like in terms of renewable energy and like the energy mix, I think they will rely on fossil fuels, if by relying on fossil fuel will be cheaper for them and much more actually cost effective.
Yeah, and I fully agree with Ahmed and with Badr. I think it's now kind of a survival game in a way for the governments. So it's really a very difficult task to solve in the long run, and many of them are now adhering to assistance from IMF, right? And this assistance comes with conditioning as well. So to the extent, for example, they're getting conditioning on limiting the subsidies to the power sector, right? They can no longer even provide support to the state-owned utilities, and we know that in many MENA countries, if we look at the emerging markets particularly, because on IC side, I'm speaking for emerging markets because we don't do GCC. So on emerging market side, most of the single buyer utilities are in a very, very, very bad shape. And there the governments would need to assess basically, you know, how sustainable entering into new renewable energy project is going to be going forward, and how this matches up with their public agenda given all the issues they have at hand.
Thank you very much, Katia. Well, as I said, I could be here for hours talking about these. I think it's very interesting, but like all good things, this webinar must also come to an end. You know, I'd like to thank all of you, and I'd like to thank also our audience actually for being with us for, you know, the entire hour, trying to well, discussing and analyzing how these the COVID-19 crisis will change the landscape of renewable energy. So once again, thank you to our speakers, thank you to the audience, and remember, you will get a recording you know, in your email probably early next week, and the slides that were presented as well. And you know, if you like these kind of webinars, I'd like to encourage you to come to our website, atainsights.com, and see what else we have prepared. So we have other COVID-19 webinars on the other regions, and well, they might be of interest as well. So thank you very much to all of you. Have a good day, and see you next time.
Thank you.
Thank you. See you next time. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.